welcome to another episode of Managing Well. I'm your host, Tonya Ladipo. I am so excited for today's episode and to have an incredible conversation with our guests as we talk about gender exclusion in the workplace. So I am so fortunate to be joined by Tiffany Tavarez and Tali Bray. Tiffany Tavarez serves as Technology DEI Council Leader and Director of Communication for Technology Diverse Segments, Representation, and Inclusion for Wells Fargo. And Tali is EVP, Technology Diversity Community Sustainability. She leads a global team with a focus on people strategy, cultural transformation, and sustainability to help drive Wells Fargo's technology's multi-year modernization transformation, to build trust within communities we serve, and to ensure the growth as their employer of choice. So Tiffany and Tali, thank you so much for joining and this great conversation I'm excited to dive right into. So
super excited too.
Good. Before we kind of start off, just to have our listeners kind of have a sense of, as we're talking about gender exclusion in the workplace and some tangible things that people, managers, and companies can do to address it, I actually want to start us off with a bit of a conversation about imposter syndrome, which is something that we hear so much when we talk about women. And so I want us to start our conversation there. And then we are going to get to some of this, to the tangible policies and techniques people can actually do. But so often we hear about women and imposter syndrome. And when we were having our initial conversations, I was reminded of a Harvard Business Review article that says, "Stop telling women that they have imposter syndrome," which I thought was an interesting read that we'll put in the show notes so people can learn more. And so I really, I want to hear from both of you, Tiffany, from Tali. I want to hear from both of you kind of your thoughts when you hear the term imposter syndrome.
Where do we even start, Tonya?
You know what? I'm gonna have Tiffany. You please go first. You and I have had this conversation a lot. I know we both have a lot of passion around this, so please kick us off, and I will chime in.
And this is why Tali's amazing. So I have to throw this disclaimer to everyone that is tuning into this amazing podcast, which is Tali is my manager. And I love that we are doing this together. Many of the topics that we're going to discuss today is something that we talk about in and outside of work all the time, something that we're, not just passionate about, but even just really curious about and sometimes angry about. So it's a really great combination. Well, I'll be really honest, imposter syndrome, I was joking over the holiday season, for me is like Santa Claus. I don't relate to the idea. We keep feeding it, thinking it will eventually benefit us. And the hype around it has grown way more significant than the reality of it. So disgust is a feeling that I feel really strongly about when I think about that concept. It's a concept that countless individuals and organizations have profited off of. It is an ugly monster that many, for some reason, continue to give life to, but it is also a brilliant strategy to ensure that those who have been historically oppressed continue to sustain a narrative that they shouldn't be where they aren't wanted. And I also consider it to be fundamentally culturally incompetent. It distracts us from the real issues at hand, which is really about psychologically safe spaces that cultivate the ability for people to show up as they are, and whatever that means for them continues to elude women, especially women of color. It also means there continues to be a lack of leadership of people who are willing to bring those who look different than them along with them in a way that doesn't make them feel threatened, inadequate, or believe that providing someone with validation takes away from their power. So that's what I'll start with.
Great start.
Yeah, and so Tiffany and I have talked about this a lot, and not surprisingly, I'm going to agree with everything she says. I think one of the things, and this was in the Harvard Business Review, so I am borrowing from an idea that was shared there, but I think the fundamental flaw with imposter syndrome is it's about fixing women instead of fixing the dynamics of where they work. And that's what's so problematic and offensive, and why, to Tiffany's point, it just propagates this continued system that is based on excluding certain populations. And so to Tiffany's point, it is at its height for women of color, for queer women, right? For, trans femme, non-binary, like these systems are designed so this, to exclude, right? To center power within a certain group. And so when we tell someone we're an imposter, it's like, oh, Tiffany, you know what, man, you just gotta be a little bit different, and then you will fit into this system, versus saying, hey, this system is flawed. And if we really believe that our organizations are most, impactful, and I always go back to the data, most profitable when they represent the communities they serve, you're not going to do that if you don't bust open those systems and start to really create place for people. And so I also take offense at the idea that it's problematic for me to have insecurity. I have insecurity every single day, and I want it to be okay for me to have insecurity. I'm nervous being here right now. I want that to be okay. That doesn't make me an imposter. It does not make me a fraud. So it is just this entire framing, to Tiffany's point, that is, I think, what did you say? Offensive? What was the word you used?
Disgust was the word I remember.
Yeah, disgust. Yes, it is disgusting. And it's self-propagating. And it is one of the many things I think we'll talk about today, where systems still fundamentally benefit those that they center, even when we talk about, oh no, we're going to be inclusive. Oh no, we're going to look at representation. If you will fit into this model, and you're still going to be excluded to a certain extent.
And the systems that center certain people, but we're also created by those same people, right? So that it continues.
Of course.
It continues. And so what I'm hearing from both of you that I think is really important, just to hone in on, is that it's not an individual woman's responsibility. It's not on the individual, right? It is a fundamental problem with the system, right?
Yeah.
That needs to be addressed. And when we think about creating inclusive workspaces, that it has to be done from a systemic perspective for it to be genuine and for it to actually make a real impact.
Yeah, and Tonya, I'm really glad that you shared the article. I'm curious if I don't know, Tali, actually, I'm curious about your opinion here as well. Did you notice in the article they kept interchanging in terms of language, the phrase of doubting your abilities with distrusting your success? And it was used interchangeably, and I thought that was really interesting because I don't find those two things the same. And so to Tali's point, which is something that I really admired about her off the bat, which is, look, we're not saying that we're not trying to validate when you feel anxiety or have self-doubt, lack of clarity, lack of reassurance. Like, those are feelings that are real. Only you can validate them. They're totally your own. You are in control of your feelings. That's something that you own. But the distrusting of your success, right? Because initially the whole concept around imposter syndrome was really targeting and really trying to speak to high achieving women to begin with. I found that to be really problematic. So I don't know, Tali, if you popped that as well.
I picked up on that as well. And one of the first, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but one of the first examples that they cited was this woman that was organizing an event, a Black woman. She was the only Black woman on her team organizing this event. She knew she was doing, she knew she was doing a good job. She knew she was competent, but she was basically facing, discrimination and bias in her work environment, ultimately resulting in conflict and her being demoted. And what she knew about herself was, this was not a lack of her self-confidence. This was not a lack of, her competency that held her back. It was, repeatedly facing a system that is built on racism and bias. And so I think, to your point, that is really important to differentiate, hey, my success is valid, but this system won't see it or doesn't recognize it, versus, oh, I'm just having a rough day. I'm feeling insecure. Like, we really need to allow people to be people, which means like all of the, frailties we bring to the environment. And then also recognize that we can have that and our success. And the really frustrating thing is, and I think this is so true for women of color, and queer women, particularly for queer women of color, when your success, you're competent, your success is there and it is being diminished. Like, you talk about women of color 2 years in the workplace and they switch roles. I mean, I can't imagine how so demoralizing, so frustrating to see. I know I'm doing good work, but it's not being recognized. So no matter how good I am, no matter how competent I am, that's the systemic piece. And so I do think that this whole idea of imposter syndrome really touches on a much larger issue around, systemic bias that exists in the workplace, because it exists outside of the workplace as well.
Right, which I think is important. I always say when we're working with organizations, like the workplace is a microcosm of the world. So the problems we're having in the workplace is because those are the problems we're having in the world that have not been resolved. And so leaders in the workplace have a great responsibility and are being called to task now in ways they weren't before to do it better and differently than we're seeing in society. And so as you're talking, I was also thinking, you know, I was thinking a couple of things. You know, every time I hear you say women of color, queer women, the more marginalized people are, the more biases that they have to navigate. So I think I just wanted to, I think the three of us, we're here there, but I wanted to kind of pull that piece out for listeners. If there's a question of like, why does she keep saying, you know, women of color? Why does she keep adding queer women? The more marginalization that people experience with intersectional identities, the greater the bias and the harder the workplace.
And I think, you know, I would be remiss, like, I think one of the groups, and we talk about this a lot, that is most marginalized are, you know, women with disabilities and people with disabilities in general. But when you look at the intersection of disability, whether it's cognitive, physical, visible, invisible, and you look at gender, and then you look at really basic things like just accessibility to tools to do your job. Like, you know, it amplifies that whole, I think it amplifies this exclusion to a much greater extent. So thank you for calling that out, Tonya, because it is really important.
You know, kind of as we're starting to talk a little bit about intersectionality, I'm curious, you know, a lot of, probably since the 80s with the push for affirmative action, I feel like a lot of organizations, I feel like I saw you take a deep breath, Tali.
You did, because I mean, I can't help myself, but what's happening with the Supreme Court right now is going to have massive reverberations, not just in academic institutions, but it will come fast for, you know, private institutions and business, and it will have impact. So yes, you saw me like brace myself.
Okay, so as we're talking about intersectionality, what I'm also starting to think about is the ways that organizations, especially in the 80s, when there was a push for more diversity and more gender diversity, the ways that intersectionality was not considered, right? And so the push for diversity and we need more women and let's get more women really defaulted to white women, right? And not considering all women. And so I'm kind of curious just to hear from your perspectives how organizations and people managers can really put policies and practices in place so that when we are trying to expand gender inclusion, that we are considering all genders.
Can I go first? I have an opinion on this one. So I want to back up for a second. And I think it's really important also that we talk about how this idea about representation and representation of women tends to center white women unless you really explicitly say, we want to center all women, which includes, we've already talked about this, women of color, queer women, women with disabilities, right? So, you know, so we know we're in a system that basically prioritizes Eurocentric, you know, masculine, heteronormative, right? It centers that strategy or the sort of those identities. And so white women are the closest in proximity to, I will say hetero cis white women are the closest in proximity to Eurocentric, masculine, right? Heteronormative men. And so when we think about that proximity and we think about the systems that benefit really sort of whiteness, and we talk about representation and this push to bring in representation, it's really easy for the system to just say, hey, great, I'm built around the structure, I prioritize these attributes, I'm going to like expand it a little bit to look at gender, but that gender still is going to fit within these basic attributes. And that, to a certain extent, is why this idea of representation, particularly around gender, can honestly, I think, actually be in some ways more damaging, because it just continues to reinforce bias built into the system than if we're really intentional and say, hey, when we talk about women, we're talking about, you know, all women. And Tiffany and I've had this conversation because, you know, I was talking to a colleague, I don't know, a year ago, and we were talking about programming. A white woman, she was like, oh, so glad there's an event finally that's for me. I was like, wait, what do you mean? I don't understand. We've had a lot of events for women. And she was like, yeah, but they're for Black or African American women or Hispanic Latino. I'm like, they're for women. Like, they're for women. You're a woman. So, even this whole idea. So when we talk about sort of policy and practice, I think it's important that we explain why this idea of representation around gender can actually, I think, be culturally damaging if we're not really thoughtful about how we're defining it and how we think about including all women. And that means actually, honestly, intentionally, I think, prioritizing women from historically marginalized communities, and at least we're like really centering that intentionally. So, that being said, when, we think about policy, and we think about practices, policy is really tricky, right? You just mentioned this a moment ago. Affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy. EEOC has policies. We are bound by those policies. We could have a completely separate conversation on the Supreme Court's, decisions and what will happen in academic environments, how that will impact then private industry, how that will impact the work that we do. So I'm going to just pause on that because that's an entirely separate conversation. But policy can drive behavior to a certain extent because it measures us. And there is some policy that holds us accountable. The federal policies that govern us, really help drive, I think, many of our people's strategies. But I think we have to really think differently between policy and practice. So if we acknowledge that this idea that practice can help remove discrimination in the work environment by not addressing it, we talked about this more broadly in society, that we can do things in a vacuum in our work environment that we cannot do more broadly, I think is really challenging. I know I'm going a little bit sideways, but it also sort of reinforces this idea, we want to believe that when people come to work, they leave everything behind. We talk about this with the Buffalo Massacre, oh, okay, you know what, just come to work, it's cool, be in your work environment, do your thing, leave that trauma behind, and then I guess go back to that trauma when you leave work. I'm not certain what the expectation was, but it doesn't work that way. And so I think it's the same way around policy and practice. This is sort of that debate of, do you drive behavior or do you drive belief? Well, I will say from my point of view, and Tiffany and I don't always agree on this. My point of view is in a business, you drive behavior and you measure that behavior and you hold people accountable to that behavior. And my hope is by measuring and holding people accountable to that behavior, there's some muscle memory, and eventually they will start to see the benefit. Driving belief without addressing some of the broader issues, within society, I think is very difficult. So how do you address some of the issues around intersectionality, representation, inclusion, engagement? My point of view is you measure people and you hold them accountable and you tie their comp to it and you tie the company's performance to it.
So Tiffany, I want to ask you to weigh in, but real quick, Tali, you mentioned it one concrete example of tying comp to it. What else would you recommend in terms of kind of your perspective of emphasizing behavior? What else would you recommend for people managers or organizations to do to really kind of create an inclusive?
So, I think there's setting KPIs, setting metrics, goals, measuring them, tying it to performance evaluation. But I also think there's, what is your CEO saying? What is your operating committee saying? What is your board saying? Are they every time there's a town hall, every time there's a global meeting, are they talking about the importance of this? So from the top, is it part of every single conversation? And are they commenting about what's happening in the world, recognizing that we don't have a wall between what happens at home and happens in the office? And then everybody throughout the organization, make it an expectation that every conversation, not literally, obviously common sense, but team meetings, town halls, ask me anything, that they always touch on the importance of this topic. You start to reinforce then the cultural aspect of it. And I think you're sort of that's a way you can start to try to drive culture and belief, and you measure and you hold people accountable through the behavioral aspects.
Thank you. Tiffany, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Oh my goodness. So it's funny, Tali, I was sitting here, I was like, oh, I hope she brings up the changing behavior versus changing belief and how they're connected. And I was sitting here, I was like, please bring it up.
I got you.
Thank you. But no, honestly, I mean, there's so much that Tali said that was so comprehensive that I think is really just a really fantastic example. I do wonder, I shouldn't say wonder, I do get sometimes concerned that when organizations do tie these sorts of, inclusive practices to compensation, right? That the behavior is solely driven for profit and not necessarily meant to inspire change in belief. And as a woman of color, I truly believe in my heart of hearts, unless I can change your belief, I may change behavior temporarily in the short term, but I don't believe that it's going to necessarily be sustained in a way that actually truly changes. It's almost like, do you want people to change or do you want people to perform? And there's some places that might be okay with that, and they use it interchangeably as long as it happens and it gets done. But I know for, people like Tali and myself that we're not just looking for people to perform and do really good for 365 days, but really commit to this, that whether or not they are in the walls of their employer, whether or not they're in the walls of their church, of their community organization, of the store, whatever space that they're in, that they actually uphold those inclusive practices no matter where they go. And that's way harder to achieve when there's no compensation attached to it.
Very true. Very true. When I think of kind of belief and behavior, I think the uniqueness of the workplace is that in some ways it can regulate behavior that other places can't. Exactly. So being able to exercise that power, and to your point, Tiffany, it doesn't necessarily mean people believe it or buy into it. And then there is the inauthenticity. It does feel inauthentic, right? If it's just the action. And so I'll tell you my hope, my belief, my thought is that when people change their behavior, even if it's just because of compensation, that over time, that does become integrated into a new belief system. Because if they're starting to interact with more people and different perspectives on a regularly consistent basis, then it starts expanding their thinking of like, oh, maybe how I was raised isn't how I want to continue to think. Yeah. Or they leave the organization because the behavior change becomes too much, because it goes against their beliefs so much that they're not willing to change their beliefs. So that's kind of how I like to think of them working together.
That's a good plan, Tonya. Good plan.
One of the things we talk about, and we talk about this specifically in the supplier diversity space, but we have this little, maybe it's a catchphrase, I don't know, but like, people go with who they know, so you got to change who they know. And so I think, Tonya, to what you're saying, like, we have to change who people know, because that's like, to now make this absurd, because that's going to change who they go with, like, if I play that out. But I do think there is something to be said for that.
And I'll go back, but quickly, I was, working with a client, and in a part of the country that was really wealthy, and being in that part of the country, suburban wealthy, which I think is different than urban wealthy, because urban wealthy, usually, even if people are segregated by geography, there are spaces where people interact more so in urban spaces. So suburban, very homogeneous, wealthy. And like being there, oh, this is what some people grew up with. They really have not had experiences with other people. And hearing it versus seeing it kind of hit me differently. And so, to your point of, sometimes the workplace, especially in organizations that are global, are the first time people are interacting with people who have significant differences.
Yeah, Tonya, I'm glad that you brought that up. And I know that this is slightly veering off topic, but these are some stories I've shared with Tali before, which is, even right as a first gen college student and graduate, a lot of my first experiences with white communities in the way that I had not engaged with them before was not until I got to college. But also in that space is where I learned that they had not engaged with many people of color or even people outside of their income bracket. And I remember there was one day someone said, "Oh my God, you know, Tiffany, it's your day downstairs. It's your day downstairs." And I'm like, "What are they talking about?" You know, and I'm rushing downstairs like, "Oh, in the cafeteria." And so I was like, "Oh, what?" I'm thinking, first of all, what's my day? Like, what are they thinking? And it was Mexican Independence Day, and they were serving like hard shell tacos, and I mean all this other stuff. And my mouth just fell to the floor, and it was really, I mean, it was hilarious. And I was like, "Please, hard shell? I'm a soft shell girl. Like, please stop." No, but seriously, I was really like sincerely shocked at the level of, and I don't want to just say ignorance, but just the lack of like self-awareness. And that was kind of the beginning of a multitude of experiences for me that really showcased like, oh, this is not just the first time, you know, someone in my family has gone to college, but it's going to be the first time that I'm going to be having a series of experiences where I am someone's first. And, you know, to have to go to that person and say, "You do know that I'm not Mexican." Like, "Oh, but all the food is the same, right?" I'm like, "Oh, wow, okay, I got to start from square one. This is very different." You know, to be told, "Hey, you know, I know that you got that scholarship because they have a quota to meet." And, you know, all these constant phrases and words that people use to ensure that, you know, they're saying, "I'm going to do all I can to make sure that I am still centered," right? "I wish you success, but I want to make sure that I'm centered." And so, you know, that's why I've been really grateful that when it comes to like programming that we've talked about, et cetera, it's always talking about inclusive language. I think, you know, talking about ways to train managers to be really mindful of what they say, because that's really going to influence the culture that they create.
Yeah.
You know, the example you just gave, the way the words and phrases that people were saying to you, and I love how you said it, so that they can stay centered instead of you. And going back to the top of our conversation with imposter syndrome, some people would kind of latch on to like, "I felt like an imposter," when you very clearly said it had nothing to do with your capabilities, but how other people were questioning your very real capabilities, which is about them and their expectation to stay centered, right? And so when you're talking about workplace policies, this is the hard belief part shift of changing that belief, that way that has been for many years, that is the only way. And what we're saying now is not only is it the only way, but it is not the way forward. It is not the best way to work. That belief of centering generally one type of person has to shift for it to be an inclusive space. And then going back to Tali's point, that will then ultimately be profitable and more beneficial for the organization, right? And so, Tiffany, you start to say, and I'm just curious to hear more, like, what are some of the ways that people managers and or leaders, right? So depending on whatever level you are in the organization, that can really make an impact on building an inclusive culture?
Oh my goodness, I feel like Tali would be way more appropriate to answer this question. You know, in my, I am not a manager, but I am, as Tali loves to remind me, I'm responsible for influencing a lot of people and making sure that they jump on board, which sometimes could be harder to do, right? Because you're not a manager and you know, the whole you're supposed to is not there. So there are a couple of things. I mean, for me, the first and foremost, anyone knows me, I have to lead by example. I mean, the old saying of, you know, do unto others as you would want them done to you, that still holds true. Everything from, you know, again, the language that you use, to the way that you consider people. And, you know, it's funny, I remember there was one role I had with a company, not Wells Fargo, that we, you know, I used to go in, I would just keep my head down, do my work, et cetera. But I didn't really understand at the time that the leader that I was working with and supporting was the top leader, and there were a number of people I had to interact with in order to get to her. Essentially, it was like a chief of staff type of role. And the one thing I failed to realize, and when I really limited myself and how I engaged with them and spoke to them and simply asked how they're doing, was, first of all, I was not just setting a really great example for myself in terms of how is it I wanted people to engage with me, but I was also making her look bad, right? Because all of our reputations are tied to one another. And therefore I'm like, oh, well, if I'm making her look this way, making her look short, making her look uninterested, then I must be doing that as well on behalf of the company. And so I really had to take time to then separately build individual relationships with people and make sure that Like, hey, the trust that I'm trying to build in you is going to be reflected in how we work with each other. And that's something I know I was missing as an employee from managers that did not do that with me. And so even though I kept thinking, hey, I may not be a manager, but these are still behaviors that I can echo and take to heart. That was something that I know I started to do. And the last thing, before I do pass it on to Tali, because I believe she's way more qualified for this, is, one of my favorite quotes is by an Irish author named Sam Beckett. And he said, words are the clothes our thoughts wear, right? So again, Tali and I talk about language all the time. So the words you use and how you use them in the workplace rather, it really informs culture. And so when I'm being really intentional in how is it I speak to you, it's not just because I'm trying to be nice to you. It's not just because I have nothing else to say. I'm really, from an optics perspective, trying to show you that you matter and that what you think and how you feel really matters. And I really am interested in making sure that all of us are on the same page for whatever goal it is that we need to achieve.
Tiffany, I was just jotting the quote down. I love that and the way you explained it. And before, Tali, I ask you for you to weigh in on this. You were saying, Tiffany, you're not a people manager, but you're an influencer. And so I think I just wanted to again kind of say that again, because there could be people who are listening who are not people managers who still have an incredible amount of power as influencers. So whether it is power to peer-to-peer, power to levels above or below, right? But to your point, like that connectivity, that connective tissue to influence how we talk to each other, how we expect to be spoken to, all of that. I think when I heard that, I was realizing, wait, that is, Tiffany has a very powerful position. And I just don't want, I don't want people to overlook that, that power and then responsibility that comes with the power, which you very clearly take on. So thank you.
Appreciate that. Well, thank you.
Tali, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I actually want to continue pulling needling that thread, pulling that needle, whatever that saying is, as it relates to leaders and influencers. One of the things that I've been thinking about and that we've been talking about are basically creating influence maps. So for your audience, thinking about, okay, if I'm a leader, and look, we're all leaders. I mean, it's cliche, but we lead ourselves. We show up every day. We choose how we show up. And, to Tiffany's earlier comments, that is how people see us, and it influences how they see themselves. So this whole idea of being influencers, if we think about driving cultural change, we should take a lesson from all of those incredibly savvy TikTokers, who have, when you think about who you want to influence, what's your map? Who are the stakeholders are you going after? What language is going to resonate with them most? One of the things Tiffany is very savvy at, and I feel like we're having this mutual love affair on this call, and I just that's very strange, but it's true. One of the things she's really savvy at is figuring out, okay, who's who are the key stakeholders? What's that influencer map look like, and what's going to resonate with each stakeholder? Because you're not going to go with one size fits all. You obviously want to think about who you're speaking to, what's going to really resonate with them. So if you take this idea and you think, and I'm going to tie this back to driving belief, not necessarily behavior, but if you take this back to driving belief and who, we are as leaders, regardless of whether we're people managers or not, and how we connect to the influencers who may have much broader reach, that's the way to amplify cultural messages around belief. And that amplification allows us to scale incredibly, particularly when you're talking about an organization like we're in, where we have, roughly 40,000 people. Our team, we're 15 people. We see ourselves as catalysts. We see ourselves as influencers. And that's an incredibly important position, and it's an incredibly impactful position, but we're not hiring thousands of people. We're not leading town hall, So I think that idea of influencer is really important, regardless of whether you are a people manager or you're an individual contributor. The one other thing that I want to mention, and for me, it's interesting, this whole idea about language and Tiffany's experience. Okay, so language about people wanting to continue to center themselves. We center ourselves by othering other people. So I think that's something we should all, or I encourage your listeners, I encourage myself, I think about this a lot. What am I doing intentionally or unintentionally to other you when I'm talking to you? And am I doing that because, and I know this is something we may get to if we have time, because I'm gatekeeping? And as long as I can other you, I get to gatekeep, or is there a reason I'm doing that? So I also encourage people to think about that, not just what, and particularly for people like in, sort of dominant groups, right? Majority groups. Like, is my othering intentional? Is it to gatekeep you? Is it because I just don't understand? Is it honest? Is it ignorant? So I think it's important that we all think about that as well.
I'm so glad you said that, and gave kind of the self-reflection questions we can ask ourselves. But your point about gatekeeping, especially as we were just talking about the power people have to be influencers, there's also the power to be gatekeepers. And I think I do want to hear more, especially, we often hear and talk about, it's the old boys club, meaning like old white men are the ones that are in charge and that they're the gatekeepers. And it's not always them only. So I would love to hear from both of you really, your thoughts, your experiences with various gatekeepers, and then specifically what needs to be done differently. Because when you have power, you are going to use it. It's just a matter of how, right? So I would love to hear from both of you.
Oh my goodness, gatekeepers, they're abundant out here in these streets, Tonya. They really are. So the one thing that I do want to start with is actually just reminding people that gatekeeping doesn't look one way, right? Tonya, you mentioned this. It's not just, your neurotypical cisgender heterosexual white male, right? It's not just him. It could be other women. Sometimes it could even be other women of color. So there is diversity around where oppression comes from. So just know that, and I say that to say, because to me, that's why gatekeeping, it's really a form of, in a lot of ways, white supremacy. And that's, to me, one of the most successful things that white supremacy has done, is to recruit soldiers that don't even look like them to uphold that concept.
Wait, say more. Tiffany, please, say more about that piece right there. I think it's a really important piece. Just say more, please.
So there was, and it's funny, and the reason I'm even bringing this up, so years ago, I was in Nigeria for a friend's wedding, and there's a studio we got to visit, and this artist had a flyer on his wall that said, colonialism was a startup, and that completely blew my mind. And I just found that, wow. I just, literally all of us that saw, I was with a group of friends, we just kind of were floored and just took a moment to process. And we started to have a conversation. And then I realized, when we started to talk about, because we were using essentially workplace terms like marketing and, circle back and all these different terms that we use day to day, and attach them to concepts outside of the workplace that were considered bad, offensive, oppressive, et cetera, and in terms of marginalized people. And I realized, the most successful thing that white supremacy has done, right? Just if you were to think of it as an organization, is recruit employees, right? And recruit these soldiers that actually uphold and serve as an ambassador for what that organization, i.e. white supremacy, stands for. And the craziest thing about it, which I'm sure many of us have had lived experience with it, which is you realize, not all those employees look alike. They're not all cisgender heterosexual white men that are neurotypical. Sometimes they are women, people who, as a matter of fact, for years you thought you were really close friends, you thought they're your family, and they're completely different. And so for me, that has been really wild, when if a white woman, in this particular instance as an example, may be seen as really successful and seen as having a diverse perspective because she's brought along women of color in her career and her journey, and they have been promoted and had access to a variety of different opportunities. But those Black women are not inclusive of people that look like them, or if they are very specific, even the way that they may look, right? If they don't feel comfortable having natural hair, if they are of a certain age, if they don't speak up, et cetera, then you start to realize you're also being very specific, right? Because one of the most dangerous quotes is empower women to me, because oftentimes the most empowered women never, ever would think to curate what women deserve to be empowered. And that's oftentimes what happens in gatekeeping.
As opposed to taking in all of the women who are competent versus the ones who are going to fit into a particular mold, right? And continue the status quo, which is a whole nother conversation about why people do that. But to your point, that not all gatekeepers look one way. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this story, Tiffany, but also kind of really, I think, explaining that in such a clear, concise way. Thanks. I find it's hard to explain how people can uphold and be soldiers of white supremacy when they're not white. And so just the way you explained it just seemed so clear. So I'm grateful.
And Tali, the thing that Tali does for me on a day-to-day basis remind me how nuanced this work is. I mean, that's like a word that, it's funny, I'd never really used it in my vocabulary. It's not a word that I considered, but because of her, it's something that I have to remind myself, because that's, to me, a strength of hers. That's something that's a reminder and something that I practice every day. So, and there's a lot of nuance in that space. And that's why, for me, it's been hard to articulate. So
yes, thank you. Thank you.
You know,
Tali, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but I want you to weigh in.
Yeah, I feel like as a white woman on this call, and there are many white women who are gatekeepers, and this whole idea, particularly when it comes around women. So I talked about this a bit before, this idea of increasing representation, but keeping it within a system, reinforcing that system, right? So if white, cis, hetero, neurotypical women are the closest fit to what that system centers, creating space for them is the least threatening to disrupting that system, because that system benefits their whiteness, white supremacy. And this idea of, this is all about proximity to power, right? All of this is about proximity to power, proximity to access to resources, decision-making, influence. So if I have the opportunity to get closer to that power, I am incented to maintain that power, regardless of whether I'm a white woman. I mean, let's be honest, look at the Proud Boys. There are, non-white members of like white supremacist organizations. And it is mind-boggling to a certain extent. But part of it, I think, is the closer I get to whatever I consider to be that access of power, the more invested I am in maintaining it. And so when I think we see white women as gatekeepers, particularly in the workplace, because we're here to talking about the workplace, but particularly when we see that, it's about, I have finally had this opportunity to get close to having influence, power. Why on earth would I risk this moment? Because it's been really hard to get here.
Yes.
It's been really, really hard to get here. So why would I now dismantle the system where I just finally got access?
Yes.
And so I think one of the things to like make this practical that we should be really intentional about, and I think particularly as white women, is when we get proximity and when we start, is to ensure that we are really opening that door, opening the aperture, and truly being intentional about creating, access for everyone, while also being really thoughtful about, okay, what in this system can we do to dismantle some of the things that are really problematic and ultimately stunt a people strategy. So I'm always going to tie this back to like people strategy, work, and profitability, which I know is like stuff talking about money. But, I do think that there is a really important aspect that if you don't do this well, your people strategy will suffer. And particularly with demographic, generational shifts, like people have to figure out how to do this. And that does mean that the power center is going to look different. And that's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Yes. And it's going to take a lot of courage to make those shifts. I know we're at time. And so I think if either of you have one thing that you would want our listeners to think of or do to take a step further on true gender inclusion in the workplace, what would you say?
So I'm going to use a quick example. We've had conversations, and I've had this conversation with the CEO of Lesbians Who Tech, and we've talked about how she'll reach out to organizations and they will say, oh, hey, I got women covered. I'm at Grace Hopper. I got women covered. I'm with Girls Who Code. And this idea that you don't have women or any demographic covered because they're not monolithic. Please just remember, no single population is monolithic. So you don't have one covered just because you're talking to one component of that group.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's going to be really fun to follow, Tali. That's great. Thank you so much. The last thing I guess I can think of, and I do want to target this message specifically to marginalized women. I think it's really important to carry a message, which is, your quick replies and ability to not even just replies, but even your ongoing expectations of statements that you feel diminish you and oppress who you are doesn't refute your mental exhaustion. And it is okay to completely feel like you're not validated at times. I think that's totally human and fine. But just know that, it is worse than a war sometimes. It is psychological terrorism, what many people go through day to day, trans women, Black women, Latina women, women with disabilities, et cetera. That is not just meant to hurt you, but to systemically break down the person you've worked so diligently to become. And all of these aggressors just simply, prove that aggressors will try to bully their way into creating a culture where they don't want you there, or they don't want you to feel empowered. And that has nothing to do with you. As women, it's easy for us to revert to a state of mind where we're going to walk around with a toolbox, right, ready to fix everything, but never really think about and what happens when we break, right, and who's going to fix us. So make sure that you're very intentional in taking care of yourself. And if you are someone that witnesses something like that, leadership isn't leadership unless it is inclusive and resilient to silence. So do not be complicit in the behavior for people that you say that you care about and you do nothing.
That was a perfect end. I am so grateful, Tali, Tiffany. I am so grateful for your thoughtfulness, for your, I was going to say courage, but this is who you are. I think it might be courage for some people. Maybe it's just for who you are, but you're for showing up as you and bringing you and all of you to our conversation. And I think we're all better for it. So thank you. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Tali. Thank you, Tonya.
Take care. Thank you for listening to the Managing Well podcast. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to learn more about today's topic, go to www.theladipogroup.com/podcast for a worksheet on today's episode.